Hey y'all, real quick before the video starts, just wanted to give a shout out to the person who recommended this case to me. Yes, I found your comment. So thank you so much to Jessica Victoria Carrillo. It is Carrillo, right? Not Carrillo. Let me know if that is how you pronounce your name. Thank you so much, Jessica, for recommending this case. I got totally wrapped up in it, and yeah, just wanted to give you a shout out. Thank you again. And yeah, guys, recommend cases to me. I love looking up the cases that you guys have recommended to me. You guys have recommended some really good ones that I am actively researching. Alrighty, now let's start part 2. Oh hey, how are you? Welcome to Crime Dive. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So that's what I talk about here. If you like true crime and you want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should totally like, subscribe, and come hang out with me every Tuesday where I'll take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. Oh, my skin is just not surviving this summer. It's so hot and my skin is just, ugh, it's so red. It's so terrible. I feel like it just gets worse as I get older. Ugh. Anyway, welcome to part 2 of our 2-parter series on the Steinberg case. In part 1, we went over who Steve and Elana were, how they met, what their married life was like. We went into Steve's gambling addiction that he had. We went into Ilana and who she was and how she coped. And then we went to the horrible night of May 27th, 1981, when Ilana was stabbed to death in her own bed. And then we ended with the investigation that was starting, alright? That was where we left off with part 1. And in this video, we're going to get into the investigation surrounding Ilana's murder. We will be talking about more sort of gruesome details about the crime scene, so be forewarned about that. And we will get into the subsequent trial that happened, and wow, it is just infuriating and kind of amazing that this was a real life case that happened. A real life case, guys. Like this actually happened. And yeah, buckle up because there's a lot that I have to talk about. When I read about this case and the trial, it's bonkers, all right? It's just absolutely bananas. And yeah, I just really wanted to talk about it with y'all. Okay, so without further ado, let's continue on. So let's pick up where we left off, all right? Everyone's at the Steinberg residence. Steve is telling police that 2 men with bushy beards and hair came in and stabbed Ilana as he watched helplessly. And so the police were out searching for these 2 men with bushy beards. However, the police immediately suspected Steve's story, all right? And let's pick up there. So Steve had told the story about the 2 burglars, right? And the police, though they had squad cars out looking for these 2 assailants, even as they were out looking, even then, y'all, everyone on the investigator team were looking at Steve as the primary suspect. Now, some of the reasons that officers raised an eyebrow at Steve's story was that there hadn't been any signs of forced entry. So that was, that was checkmark number 1. That was suspicious. Also, the grass outside, which was damp from like a misty rain that had fallen that evening, did not have any footprints or indentations or like any type of disturbance made to it. That mist that had fallen that evening earlier was undisturbed. So that was kind of weird. And this included the grass that was immediately outside of the back porch window that was in the master bedroom that led out to the backyard. Yeah, the grass seemed undisturbed. That mist was just lying there. Additionally, there was a locked gate that was part of the Steinberg's backyard fence, and on the other side of that fence was I think a public park for the little neighborhood that they lived in, and so it led right there, okay? That gate in the Steinberg backyard, it was locked with a padlock, and that padlock was not disturbed at all. Hadn't been broken or tampered with, and the Steinbergs also kept a picnic table in their backyard right in front of this gate, and it was still there. There were no footprints or any disturbance disturbance to the table that they could see. It was still lying there up against the gate. So all these things together were, you know, making investigators raise an eyebrow. And then Officer Barnett, remember, one of the first of the 3 officers that arrived on scene at the same time, him and another fellow officer who had arrived as well, Officer Kevin Chadwick, they were both kind of talking to each other, and they were kind of talking about how strange Steve's story was. It just didn't make a lot of sense to them. They thought that it was odd, you know, that Ilana, all right, this small, petite little woman, would be a threat to anybody, yet Steve, this huge 6'1" strapping man, escaped this gruesome attack with just a gash in the hand. You know, I mean, a pretty deep gash, understandably, but that was it. While Ilana, this small, petite little woman, was so brutalized. That's what had them scratching their head. They also thought Steve's injuries didn't match up with the story that he had. Like, really, dude? Just like a singular, deep, gashing wound when allegedly these guys held you down and you tried to stop the blade from going into Ilana, and you just got out with this one single gash. Meanwhile, Ilana had been stabbed 26 times. It just didn't add up to them. Officer Barnett said that to him, from Ilana's wounds and how she was found, she had been stabbed in the back and the side by someone lying next to her. That's what the scene told Officer Barnett. There was a slash right through the mattress, and this led Officer Barnett to wonder if Ilana hadn't, like, been impaled. The way that the underwear, like the underpants, were laying out on the floor, that struck him as odd as well. It struck him as, quote, wrong, because he had seen a few burglaries and thefts in his day, and he said that they were laid out almost, like, daintily, like almost purposely. And in his experience, burglars, they're usually just kind of rifling through stuff, like left and right, and tossing stuff everywhere, and yeah, it just looked, quote, wrong to him. Both officers, Chadwick and Barnett, they also noticed drops of blood in the master bedroom. These were located by the foot of the bed, and these drops of blood were unrelated from that large pool of blood that was in the bed, and remember, it was spilling off into the floor. These drops of blood that these officers saw, this was unrelated to that. This was something else that was causing these blood drops. And we'll get back into that in just a moment. And Officers Barnett and Chadwick, they were not the only ones with their eye on Steve. Like I said, pretty much all of the investigators suspected Steve. And yeah, almost as soon as the investigation began, almost as soon as law enforcement officials showed up at the Steinberg residence, they were building a case against Steve. He was their primary suspect. Oh, and you know how I said they had officers out driving around looking for the supposed, you know, assailants with the bushy beards? So yeah, they did have officers driving around, but of course, they found nothing. Now, as soon as the forensics team showed up, they entered the master bedroom, of course, and they lifted the mattress and the box spring that it was laying on. By those drops of blood that were noticed by officers Chadwick and Barnett, you know, those, they lifted it up, and lo and behold, what do you think they found? Yep, they had found the murder weapon. Tucked in the hollow of the box spring, they found a long, blood-stained 10-inch knife. Specifically, it was a meat carving knife. You know, one of those knives that has like an accompanying fork that goes with it. It's the kind for, you know, cutting like roasts and turkeys and stuff. And this knife was Ilana's. She had been killed with her own knife. She had a matching fork that went with that knife in the kitchen. And sure enough, when the police walked from the master bedroom to the kitchen, which was 66 feet, they found the matching fork in one of the drawers. Additionally, as they were combing through the house in the master bedroom, guess what they found? They found a pile of jewelry, and this was hidden behind a mirror in the bath and like vanity in the master bathroom, which of course, you know, completely negates Steve's story that he was robbed, right? So of course they're just like, wait a minute, that's super strange. I mentioned this earlier, but yeah, the coroner would go on to find 26 stab wounds in Ilana. And these wounds, they ranged in their depth. Some were as shallow as 3/4 of an inch deep, while others were up to 4 inches deep. And at least four of these stab wounds had pierced vital organs. And this included her spleen, liver, stomach, heart, and there was even a stab wound to the temporal lobe of her brain. And at least 4 of these wounds were fatal. There were stab wounds on her arms and in the webs of her fingers, indicating that she did put up a struggle. The blood pattern also told investigators that Ilana had tried to sit up and get away as she was being stabbed, but she just lost too much blood too quickly, and thus she toppled over onto the floor, and that's how she was found. Steve, meanwhile, was treated for the wound to his hand. Like I said, even though it was a singular gash to his hand, it was, a pretty serious one, so he was rushed to the hospital. After he'd been treated and released from the hospital, he was then brought to the police station, and there, officers questioned him. Now, the working theory that investigators had at this point was that Steve's intention was to take the jewelry that they had found and claim it had been stolen like he had done so many times before, and they believed either Ilana was supposed to sleep through all of this, as he did it, or Steve planned to kill her all along and blame it on burglars. Now, they favored this latter explanation because of how far of a walk it was from the kitchen to the master bedroom. I said earlier it was 66 feet. So there was that. And I guess the drawer that knife and fork were kept in was, I guess, not in an obvious, it wasn't with the, other knives, I guess. And because of where Ilana kept it, they theorized that, yeah, someone would have to consciously know that's where that knife was kept and grab that specific one, So that was their working theory. Throughout questioning, Steve maintained his story about the 2 burglars, who he now said were wearing plastic gloves. And he thought that the knife that they used, it had to be long, because he had put his hand on the blade underneath theirs in the ensuing struggle, so he knew that it was a pretty long blade they were using. Steve recounted the events of his day and evening. He said Ilana had gone to bed early, and this was after she had asked him to crack the sliding glass door in their master bedroom to let a breeze in. He said he did his usual routine of watching TV before he too went to bed. And he said that when he lay down, Ilana was almost completely asleep, and the sliding glass door was cracked open. He said that the next thing he knew, he was awakened by Ilana's screams, and he saw 2 men in the room standing over them. He said he felt a weight on his chest as one of the men held him down while the other stabbed Ilana over and over again in front of Steve. He said he tried to stop the hand, quote, from going up and down, and this is how he had gotten his injury. He told the men where his wife's jewelry was by shouting, quote, "It's in the drawer." He said the 2 men then disappeared, and that's when Steve went running to Tracy's bedroom, and she was screaming, oh my God, what's wrong? Understandably. Steve told his daughter to call the police, and after telling her how, remember, she didn't know how, so after he did it and, got on the phone real quick and then handed it over to Tracy, he ran back to the master bedroom, and at this point, Ilana had slipped off the bed and had fallen in the position that she was found. Steve then put on his robe, and that's when the police came, cruising down the street, and then he ran out with his hand wrapped in a towel, screaming about burglars. Now, of course, police didn't buy a word of Steve's story. They had already spoken with Mitch, who informed them of Steve's financial predicament, and he also informed the Scottsdale police about the string of thefts and burglaries that Steve had experienced. Oh, just real quick, by the way, I think in last week's video, I accidentally said that Steve and Elana moved to Phoenix. They lived in Scottsdale, and that's where their home was, and that's where the crime occurred. I think I got mixed up because one of the singers' locations, one of the restaurant locations, was in Phoenix, and I think Steve managed that location at one point in time. So I think that's why I got mixed up. And so after only about 5.5 hours after calling 911, Steve was placed under arrest for his wife's murder. And he was placed under arrest at 5:30 a.m. And police said that this was the first time that Steve became visibly upset. Throughout this whole time, he had been relatively collected and cool. But yeah, when he was informed he was being arrested for Ilana's murder, that's when they saw him get angry. Now, Edith and Mitch, they still believed at this point, Steve's burglary story. However, Barney was immediately suspicious and immediately thought oh my God, my son-in-law, who I've been so close to, Steve, he killed Ilana, he killed my daughter. He immediately raised an eyebrow at Steve's behavior when they had approached the home. It just didn't make sense that Steve would be so standoffish to them, not look them in the eye, not let Edith hug them him, not say anything to Barney. Remember how close they were. Barney was like a father to him. Furthermore, remember, Steve hadn't even called Barney or Edith to the scene. It had been Mitch. Steve called Mitch, but he did not call his in-laws. Remember how close he was to the Singers, and yeah, all of that just immediately rubbed Barney the wrong way. So Steve was sitting in jail mere hours after her murder, but it said he quickly kind of grew accustomed to jail life. I guess he was able to leave messages with jailers. His friends were allowed to come visit him, and they did recall that they did feel like really cool. It was very exciting to go see their buddy behind bars. Like, oh my god, they've never been to a jail. I know. Could these people be any more upper class stereotypes? But while Steve allowed his friends and family to visit him, he had forbidden Mitch and Barney to see him. And it just seemed like Steve was just a real smooth operator from behind bars. Remember, he just has that charm, that magnetism to him that just draws people to him and makes them like him, you know? It turns out not only was it just his charm and magnetism, but it also helped that Steve eventually locked down a pretty prominent defense attorney. His attorney's name was Robert Hirsch, and Hirsch and his team, all right, they made their bread and butter on homicide cases where the client is usually kind of caught with the smoking gun, is usually the spouse or partner, and it is said Hirsch and his team they were the masters at the insanity defense. And they had actually gotten clients off on this defense, clients who had never before displayed mental health issues. He was a tremendous cross-examiner, was just very smart and sophisticated, skilled debater. He was very, very good at asking questions and asking them in a way that elicited the answer that he was looking for. You know what I'm saying? Like, he was kind of one of those operators. And he also had a knack for putting everyone else on trial except for his client. That was sort of Hirsch's strategy, all right? And he was known for this. And he was a pretty prominent guy in those legal circles because he had won some pretty prominent cases up to this point. So he was pretty well known in those legal circles. So apparently in county jail where Steven was waiting, remember I said that he was like kind of able to leave messages, his friends were coming to visit him, like he got a little bit more freedom compared to other prisoners. Apparently in the county jail, when you have an attorney, a prominent attorney at that, it is said that your jail experience is, you know, usually a bit better, you know, as good as it can be, you know. I guess like jailers usually will like leave you alone, and there's just kind of like this weird kind of like air of respect given to you a little bit. Yeah, that's what they were saying. But there was no respect given to Steve as far as the Singers were concerned. I think over the course of a few days, Edith and Mitch started to see what investigators had on Steve, and with his attitude and behavior in the days leading after his arrest, they just started, yeah, they started looking at Steve and thinking that, oh my god, he did in fact kill our daughter. And battle lines were quickly being drawn between the Singers and the Steinbergs because, of course, his family backed him up 100%. So the day after Ilana's murder, all right, mere hours, all right, so it's the daytime now, as Steve is sitting in jail, his business lawyers, who for the time were kind of holding down his defense for it, this was while his family was shopping around for attorneys, so they were holding down his defense side and his legal side while his family secured an attorney. They had gone and changed all of the locks at the Steinberg home, y'all. Okay, this is mere hours, all right? And Edith discovered this because she had gone to the home because she had Tracy and Sean in their custody. They were in Barney and Edith's custody after Steve had been arrested. And Edith had gone over to the home to get clothes. Hello, for the children. This happened in the middle of the night. Of course they were whisked away in their pajamas, and she couldn't get in the home because the locks were changed. But here's the kicker. They hadn't done anything illegal. Yeah, unless Steve was convicted of Ilana's murder, all of her bank accounts, assets, and physical possessions belonged to Steve. So his business partners, acting on as his attorney for the moment, had every legal right to do whatever they wanted to the property, which in this case included changing the locks. Can you believe that? Like I said, Steve's family stood by him. It said his sister Gloria was the one who even paid for his defense. And his family was completely unaware of Steve's gambling problem, completely unaware of his financial predicament and his problems that he was having. I mean, a lot of people were. He kept this on the DL. His awful awful mother Esther immediately started going around and bad-mouthing Ilana to anyone that would listen, saying how miserable Ilana had made her son. And this, as we will get into, is the groundwork being laid for what will be the defense's strategy at trial. So, the prosecutor in Steve's trial was prosecutor Jeff Hotham. And in his 5 years before this trial, he had never lost a case. He had never lost a jury trial. He was a 5-year veteran of the county attorney's office. It was his first and only job out of college. And yeah, he had stuck in there after college and had worked his way up to be in the major felony trial group. And working here, he got experience in murder trials, and in fact, had managed to win 5 death sentence convictions, which apparently is a pretty big deal because apparently in Arizona, like, I don't know how it is today, but at this point in time, in the early 80s, it was very tough to get a death penalty in the state of Arizona. Like, you really had to prove that the death penalty was warranted. And this guy, Hotham, had secured 5 of those. So yeah, I mean, kind of feels weird to celebrate getting 5 death sentence convictions, but yeah, he was at a career high. Like, he had never lost, like I said, a jury trial, and at this point in his career, he was just super confident and was pretty much at his peak, you know? He was riding high at this point, and now he's given this trial where, you know, Steve is kind of like sitting there caught with the murder weapon. It was found underneath the box spring, you know what I mean? So it seemed like a pretty open and shut case, but of course it wasn't. So, leading up to the trial, the defense, Hirsch and his team, they got to work, guys. This guy does his homework and his research. Like, there's a reason why Hirsch got the reputation that he did. So, Hirsch worked with a couple of psychologists and whatnot, and he got a couple of them to, of course, help in this case. So, he got one psychologist that he often worked with to diagnose Steve with, quote, dissociative reaction. And this was, I guess this is like a condition somewhat related to multiple personality disorder. And he got another doctor, Dr. Martin Blinder. He was an out-of-state expert, and he got to working for the defense. And he went around and did interviews with Steve and the Singers and the Steinberg family, you know, Steve's family, and friends. And when he interviewed the Singers, he did also interview Tracy and Sean. And so he submitted to Hirsch a 16-page report that was just a scathing indictment on how terrible the Singers and Ilana were and how great Steve and the Steinbergs were. Yeah, y'all, this report is something else. Now, in this report that Dr. Blinder conducted, he said that Steve was the real victim here. He said he was the victim of the Singers and their materialism, and that he was a, quote, henpecked husband who was in a loveless marriage to a, quote, shrewish and demanding woman. Those are, when I say quote, guys, like, those are quotes from his little report. Yeah. It attacked Ilana for her supposed shopping sprees, her spending of money, her nagging. It claimed that Ilana withheld sex as a way to control Steve. And Dr. Blinder said that it was actually Ilana who had driven Steve to gambling. Yeah. It didn't start until he was with Ilana, which of course we know is complete and utter horse crap. The report, like I said, went after the Singers as well. His report called Barney a, quote, corrupt, dissolute, stupid man, and he said that Edith was also a nagging shrew. And Steve's family, of course, were painted as just saints. They were so perfect. They were religious, simple, unostentatious, unlike the Singers. And they were, quote, pushed outside because Steinberg is consumed by the Singers' prejudices. Yeah. So when Dr. Blinder had met with the Singers to interview them and the children, he did not inform them that he was working for the defense. They had no idea. And they were like too busy mourning their daughter and planning her funeral and all that to really kind of be concerned or really think about Dr. Blinder and like what he was asking and the questions he was asking. They like did not think he was going to write this 16-page awful report that did nothing but disparage Ilana and their whole family. When Dr. Blinder came to the Singer home to interview them, I guess at one point he had made an excuse to go to the restroom, and Edith said that she heard him rifling around around in their medicine cabinets. He was trying to see like what kind of meds and pills they were on and stuff like that, just trying to be nosy, trying to gain any kind of ammo that he could. Yeah, this is supposed to be a professional, by the way, all right? Yeah, is this like blowing your mind yet? Anything that I've told you? Like, I couldn't believe when I read this. Like, it's pretty amazing. Now, when Dr. Blinder interviewed the daughters, Tracy and Sean, it said Tracy, who is about 12 at this time, she was wary of this guy, all right? She was wary of this guy. Guys, children can pick up on a lot more than people give them credit for, all right? She picked up on what he was doing. She didn't like it. She didn't like his vibe. Wasn't digging it. And it is said in her interview with Dr. Blinder, she expressed bitterness and distaste for her father. And when Dr. Blinder asked, like, oh, did your grandma tell you to say that? She retorted, quote, no, I told her. So that was one thing that Hirsch did, all right? Hirsch did his homework, guys. He did so much preparation for this trial, all right? He went to work weeding through all of the Steinberg friends of Steve, friends of them as a couple, and he was, what he was doing was he was going to gather certain ones to testify, all right? Now, many of these friends believed Steve's burglary story, and there were a spare few that didn't quite buy it, and I guess they told Hirsch to go pound sand. They were on the singer side. But Hirsch still had plenty of friends of Steve that he could choose. And through a series of like interviews and dinners and stuff, Hirsch and his team started weeding through the friends to see who would make a good witness for the defense, all right? The work that this guy did in getting his witnesses is pretty incredible. Like I said, he would invite them over in small groups for like dinner or something, and then him and his team would kind of, go around the room and kind of socialize and, of course, ask the questions that they needed to ask, and slowly picking up on which ones would make good witnesses and which ones they should just kind of stay away from. They would ask questions about Ilana's shopping. Did she spend a lot of money? Did she have a lot of clothes? Like questions like this. And like I said, there was a spare few who were kind of like raising an eyebrow and she's like, well, what does that have to do with anything? I thought like burglars like did a story. Is this not true? And they were kind of wary, but there were quite a few who, whether meaning to or not, ended up kind of laying the groundwork for what Hirsch was going to do at trial. And yeah, these friends gave Hirsch exactly what he wanted, and these were the ones chosen to take the stand. So by August, after being denied bail in July, the defense's plea had changed from not guilty because burglars had done it to, of course, what's Hirsch known for, not guilty by reason of insanity. Hirsch had gotten yet another doctor, Dr. Donald Holmes, to examine Steve. And it was actually Dr. Holmes who would put out the theory that Steve was in a, quote, deep sleep when he had stabbed Ilana. Steve was in a deep sleep when he walked the 66 feet from the bedroom to the kitchen, grabbed that knife, and then walked 66 more feet back to the bedroom and stabbed Ilana 26 times. He was in a deep sleep when he did this. Now, Dr. Holmes, he determined that Steve was a sleepwalker. And both he and Dr. Blinder had said that he was in a dissociative reaction when he killed his wife in what they called a, quote, altered state of consciousness. But it was Dr. Holmes who put the specific sleepwalking bent on this. Additionally, Hirsch is doing his research, guys. He did another rarity, which I guess is very rare for a defense attorney to do. He interviewed all of the state's witnesses before trial, had transcripts made of these interviews, and was thoroughly prepared for asking tough questions. And I said this earlier, getting the answers that he needed. He was really good at cross-examination. He was very, very good. I said it before, he was considered one of the greatest cross-examiners in legal circles. Yeah, he was that good. Now, apparently in Arizona, the defense is allowed to do this, interview the state's witnesses beforehand and all that. And yeah, that's exactly what Hirsch did. And like I said, not only did he interview them, he had transcripts made of these conversations and he asked specific questions. Now, it is said, after Hirsch's questioning of the state witnesses, said Hotham started becoming not as confident as he once was. He was starting to become despondent and started lacking confidence. silence. Not a good sign. And remember, this was before the trial had even begun, guys. It didn't help that the prosecution was kind of struggling at this point. One of the criminalists, named Cecil Kirk, he had kind of bungled and had not yet identified the prints found on the murder weapon. And the defense, of course, knew this. But the blood on the knife was already confirmed to be that of Steve and Ilana's. So there was that. Now, by February of 1982, as jury selection began, Hirsch offered a plea deal to the prosecution, offered a plea deal to Hotham, that Steve would plead guilty to manslaughter and serve no prison time. And Hotham, of course, laughed at this. Steve's trial would last about 2 weeks, and it began February 2nd, 1982. Now, when the trial began, needless to say, Steve didn't look his best. I mean, jail life is not going to suit anyone. Doesn't matter how easy of a time you have it in there, you know? So he looked pretty bad, and Hirsch was so appalled at Steve's attire that he actually had his team run out to Sears and get a couple of, like, cheap suits. And this was actually gonna add to their strategy that they were going to present in trial. That Ilana was a professional shopper, would always buy the best for herself, but didn't really do the same for Steve. Steve even said that Ilana bought all of his clothes and even laid them out for him, and that he had no say in it. Give me a break. So the trial begins, all right? And y'all, this trial. So at trial, Hotham never presented a motive for Steve to kill his wife. He never presented a motive to the jury. That's just a number of the questionable decisions that Hotham would make in this case. He also never brought up two facts that probably could have helped the prosecution. So remember I said earlier, Tracy had mentioned that her father had washed his hands earlier in the evening before she had called 911? Well, Hotham never brought that fact up. He also never brought up the fact that Tracy also said that her father had swore at her when he had come to her room. And this was when he had repeated his instructions for her to close her door because she wanted to check on her mom. And apparently he said shut your fucking door or something like that, to that effect. And Hotham, again, never pursued this angle either and never brought it up because this claps back against the, defense's mild-mannered Steve, who was in a deep sleep and altered state of consciousness that night. You know what I mean? That kind of puts a little bit of a hole in that, you know what I mean? And a good prosecutor could have used that at trial. But yeah, for whatever reason, Hotham never brought up either of these two facts at trial. In fact, Hotham's background info on Steve, the Steinbergs in general, was so scarce and so lacking, he wasn't even aware of Steve's past history with gambling. It had come about as a recent thing. Yeah, he did not even know of Steve's gambling addiction in Chicago, that he had struggled with this addiction since adolescence pretty much. He did not know that because he did not do a lot of background info on Steve or Ilana. And as we'll see, that is going to be a costly mistake. Now Hirsch, of course, as the defense, took advantage of this assumption that Steve's gambling was a recent thing and, painted it, of course, to the jury, not just that it was recent, but it started all because of Ilana and her materialism. Steve was working so hard, okay? And no matter how hard he worked, it just wasn't enough for, quote, dominating Ilana. Yeah, Hirsch said Ilana demanded the nicest of things, always demanded the best, and so Steve was driven to his gambling. He had no other way to satisfy his demanding wife. This was the defense that Hirsch was presenting at trial. Yeah, and because Hotham did not do his research, he didn't know about Steve's history of gambling, which of course he could have, used as a motive. If he had done his research, he could have found out that they were actually arguing in the weeks and days leading up to her murder. But no, he didn't. Now, poor 12-year-old Tracy. She, of course, was called to the stand, of course. Tracy's sharp, all right? She sees the intricacies of what's going on here. And she was very wary of Hirsch, and she was cognizant of what he was doing. Yeah, this 12-year-old was cognizant of what he was doing, but all these other adults in the room, wait until we get into it, are just lapping it up. Tracy's very bright, and again, children pick up on more than adults like to give them credit for. So in Tracy's testimony, all right, Hirsch was, of course, trying to shorten the amount of time that Steve was in the master bedroom. He was trying to shorten the amount of time that Tracy heard her mother scream to the time that her father appeared in her doorway. Okay? I don't even know what that was. Okay? I meant to say of course, and then I said okay, and it just kind of came out like that. So yeah, he was of course trying to shorten that time, right? Because the shorter amount of time Steve's in that master bedroom, the shorter amount of time he has to stage the crime scene, as investigators and the prosecution was saying. And again, 12 years old, Tracy's aware that Hirsch is trying to do this with her testimony. She's aware. But no matter what he did, Tracy maintained that it was approximately 45 seconds between the time that she heard her mother cry out and the time that her father appeared in her doorway. And she stood firm on that. And she said that she stood firm on that because she remembers sitting there in bed and wondering like what was going on and, why this was happening. Like, she was cognizant of what she was thinking at that time. She also refused to speak fondly of her father on the stand, even though Hirsch was trying to kind of prod her to. So he asked her things like, quote, "Oh, your father would read to you in bed, tuck you in, and kiss you every night, right?" And she just shot back, quote, "I told you he just did that sometimes and didn't do it that night." And when Hirsch exaggerated how close Steve was with Tracy and Sean, Tracy said, quote, "I was just as close with my mom, maybe a little closer to my mom." She was not having it. Now, after her testimony in court had been dismissed for that day, it said Tracy requested to meet her father, and so they met in the courtroom. And through tears, I guess she just kept asking her father, quote, "Why did you do this to us?" like over and over again. And it is said that she never saw her father again after this. This was the last time she met him. So, another day at trial. Another blow to the prosecution would actually come from their own witness, all right? So it came from the state medical examiner's office, and their witness was Dr. Thomas Jarvis. He had been assigned Ilana's case, and in the state of Arizona, whoever is assigned to the case is the one that goes to court and testifies. So this was Dr. Jarvis. In his testimony, he unwittingly handed a huge boost to the defense. He did this when he stated that 4 of the 26 wounds that Ilana had suffered were fatal. One went through the lung, another one went through a vein in the heart. He said that this one was instantly fatal, another one through the spleen and stomach, and one through the back into the kidney. Now, Dr. Jarvis said that the other 22 wounds that she had received were, quote, superficial, all right? Now, the term used in this context, that the wounds were superficial, has a very different meaning to Dr. Jarvis than what it probably means to you and me. I'm sure you're similar. When someone says that a wound is superficial, you assume, oh, okay, it's not too deep, it's kind of a shallow cut, not fatal, right? Like that's kind of what you assume, right? But that's not what a superficial wound means to Dr. Jarvis. To Dr. Jarvis, superficial just means that the wound terminated and ended in fat or bone without penetrating an organ. That's what a superficial wound means to Dr. Jarvis. Now, the last of the stab wounds that Ilana had received had been in her brain. Remember I said that there was a stab wound to the temporal lobe of her brain? That was like one of the very last wounds that she had received. Now, this wound to the brain was also fatal, according to Dr. Jarvis. However, by the time Ilana had received it, her blood pressure had dropped and she was either dead or nearly dead. Now, the police and the prosecution's theory was that Steve's hand had slid down the blade when he went to penetrate her skull, and that's how he received that gash in his hand. And the print of his index finger, it was on the handle, and his palm print was found on the blade, both of course in blood. Now, Hotham, because he's really not that great of an interviewer, honestly, he neglected to ask Dr. Jarvis about the type of force it takes to stab someone in the brain, to go through the skull and into the brain. That takes quite a lot of force. And people were saying that this would have at least put a hole in the theory that Steve was like in this deep trance-like sleep, you know what I mean, and didn't know what he was doing. It would have, countered that, saying like, no, this was intentionally done, and here's the proof. This is how tough it is to go through the skull, But Hotham didn't, and so Hirsch made Dr. Jarvis's testimony actually work for the defense. So the defense's theory was that Steve had actually held the knife by the blade throughout the entire attack because he was, quote, in an altered state of consciousness. All right, remember, that was what their whole case was reliant on. And because he was in such a deep sleep, he held the knife by the blade throughout the entire attack. And basically what Hirsch was doing here was pretty brilliant, honestly. He was making the murder weapon a piece of evidence for the defense and what they were going for, Like, honestly, it's quite impressive, the amount of, research that Hirsch has done for this case. Like, I'm not gonna lie, it was pretty impressive. Because remember, if we're going for the insanity defense, you're saying that he's in a deep sleep, in an altered state of consciousness. Like, what person in their right mind would grab a knife by the blade and stab, you know? Like, it makes no sense. So it actually works for them. And then remember, they had to explain away his palm print on the blade. This did that beautifully. And of course, the prosecution thought this was absurd because remember, this blade was 10 inches long, was super sharp. Like, if he had done that, he definitely would have received more than just a deep gash on his hand, you know? But, Hirsch, man, remember, like I said, he's really good at cross-examining people, like really good at asking questions and getting the answers that he's seeking. And in his cross-examination of Dr. Jarvis, that's exactly what he does. Because let's remember, guys, this is in front of a jury, right? It's 12 people that you, have to convince, right? And part of a trial, it's not just facts and evidence, right? It's presenting your case to the jury in a digestible way, in a, to a certain degree, entertaining way, right? Like, you gotta keep their attention on what you're saying. And Hirsch just did this beautifully, all right? So, in his cross-examination, he got Dr. Jarvis to equivocate when he asked him about the shallowness of those other 22 wounds, and asked Dr. Jarvis if, quote, the shallowness of the depth would suggest these wounds are consistent with somebody grasping the bottom portion of the blade. To which Dr. Jarvis responded, quote, consistent, I suppose. I don't like the theory very much, frankly, but it's possible, and the physical evidence is consistent with it. Yeah, this was a huge blow to the prosecution's case. Huge blow. And what this did, it planted the seed in the jurors' minds that maybe Steve was in an altered state of consciousness. After all, who would hold a knife like that, right? And again, going back to his earlier testimony, I think every juror misunderstood Dr. Jarvis when he talked about the superficial wounds that Ilana had. They took it to mean what most of us think when we hear that word described in that context, right? The wounds she received were superficial. That's how they interpreted it. So all in all, Dr. Jarvis's testimony was so damning to the prosecution because it really did undermine the ferocity of Ilana's attack and just made it seem that it wasn't as brutal as it really was. Oh, and get this. Dr. Jarvis was actually the father-in-law of one of the defense attorneys. Like, you know, because Hirsch, you know, you have like a team of lawyers. Yeah, he was actually the father-in-law of one of the team members on Hirsch's team. So I'm not even sure why he was allowed to testify. I know I said this earlier. Yeah, Arizona state law, like whatever examiner or pathologist gets assigned a case, they will then go to court and testify to that case. That's what they're assigned to. But I can't believe Hotham wouldn't use this as an opportunity to at least bring in an outside pathologist as well, you know? So as the trial continued, Mitchell was of course brought in as a witness, and like with Dr. Jarvis, he unwittingly was a huge boost to the defense. So Mitch and his wife, they had actually ended up abandoning all of the BB Singer's restaurants. Remember, they were suffering pretty hard when Ilana's murder happened, and in September of 1981, they had ended up just taking off and abandoning the restaurants, leaving over 100 employees and managers without pay, as well as creditors, of course. They had actually taken off to Denver, Colorado, where I read that they did open up some more restaurants, and Mitch had flown back to Arizona to testify in the trial. Now, unfortunately, remember I said this not too long ago, part of a trial, it's not just the evidence, right? It's how you come across to the jury. It's very, very important, right? Because people are fickle, right? Well, unfortunately for the prosecution, Mitch came across as the jury as lacking any humbleness. They thought he was brutally honest to the point of being kind of like rude. And his whole demeanor, I guess, just did not do the prosecution any favors at all. And he was, of course, putty in Hirsch's hands. Remember, this dude is so good at cross-examining. Really good. And Mitch, I guess, was just putty in his hand. He was pretty much confirming the things that Hirsch had been going on about Ilana up until this point, that, you know, she was a professional shopper and superficial. He did confirm that she did like nice things, needed to have nice things, and if she was deprived of those nice things, she would get, quote, in a crummy mood. But Mitch also said, quote, that would be pressure for her, yes. I mean, it would for anybody, though, if they had no money. He said that his sister was aggressive, like himself, saying just that, quote, she's like myself, and he described Steve as the more, quote, passive type. Now, to Mitch, of course, being aggressive and wanting nice things, like those are like normal attributes to have, right? They're the same things that he wanted, right? And the same things that he achieved. And, you know, that was like his personality, right? So like that was normal to him. He was just saying like, yeah, of course. Like, doesn't everybody want nice things? However, he really lacked the insight that his 12-year-old niece had in really seeing the intricacies of what was going on in this trial. Because if you think that they have disparaged Ilana thus far, oh boy. No. We haven't even gotten into that yet. But yeah, Mitch was just sort of incapable of kind of seeing the nuances that were going on. I can't even remember if he stayed throughout the whole duration of the trial. I can't remember. But yeah, after Mitch's testimony, he pretty much, however unwittingly, pretty much reiterated what Hirsch was painting Ilana as: domineering, how she emasculated Steve, and that she had driven him to his gambling. In fact, the defense had even brought up that Vegas incident, where Steve had signed Mitch's name to the $9,000 marker. They tried to blame that on Ilana too, saying that when he had been up earlier that evening, remember he was up when Mitch went to bed, he had actually called Ilana earlier that evening and told her that he was up. And Hirsch was claiming that Ilana then demanded the money, and so that's why Steve went and gambled it away. Now, there were only 2 witnesses who were part of the Steinbergs' inner friend circle that were called by the prosecution, and they were only called because Steve had called them the night of the murder. Remember, he was calling everybody and their mother? So that was the only reason they were there testifying. And they were Steinberg friends, Mike Berkovich and Rona Goldfarb. So Mike and Rona were among the friends of the Steinbergs who did not take Steve's side and did not believe his story. And in fact, Hirsch was actually very wary of them when he was sifting through the Steinberg friends and figuring out, who to bring to trial and whatnot. He was very wary of these 2. Now, while they were on the stand, Hotham was only concerned about the events of that night when Steve had called them, and did not question Rona, who was one of Ilana's closest friends, about Ilana's character, concerning her shopping sprees, concerning her marriage, all the stuff that Hirsch was attacking Ilana for. No, Hotham didn't even bother to ask one of her closest friends what she thought. What was her perspective on this? He was only concerned about the events of that night. Now, when Hirsch cross-examined Rona, she spoke about the last time that she saw the couple. It was the 25th, and she said that everything seemed fine, and at this time, Steve was actually looking for a new car. And when Hirsch asked, quote, "Ilana wanted a car, did she not?" Rona shot back, quote, "No, it was Steve." So that was what the prosecution had presented. All right, guys, and now let's get into what Hirsch brought to the table. So when it was the defense's turn to present their case to the jury, Hirsch, in his opening statement, he put out 4 theories to explain what happened that night, all right? 4 theories. So the first theory was that Steve was indeed telling the truth. It was these 2 burglars. Though even he admitted that Steve's story was hard to believe. There was no evidence supporting it. The second theory was that Steve had killed Ilana after the 2 had gotten into an argument, in which case that he went and got the knife, came back, and stabbed her. Hirsch said, though, that this wasn't plausible because even according to Tracy, she did not hear any argument happen that night, and there was no commotion. So he said that theory was implausible. The third theory is that Steve killed Ilana with forethought and premeditation after she had gone to sleep and that he had planned it. But Hirsch said that this wasn't plausible because this went against Steve's character and the character that he had been for 27 years. Or excuse me, 37 years. He was 37 when he was at trial. My bad. And he also said that it's outlandish to think that this was premeditated because of just how sloppy and ridiculous the crime scene in his story was. He was like, surely if someone was going to premeditate this, they'd come up with a better story than that, Basically saying dude, come on, who would be dumb enough to try to premeditate this? Who would do such a crappy job of premeditating this and setting up such a crappy story in a crappy crime scene, So that was basically what Hirsch was saying, so that theory's impossible. The last theory, and that was this is the theory that Hirsch wanted the jury to buy, was that Steve killed Ilana when he was mentally confused and that he acted, quote, in some confused state, some dissociative state. Now, the defense ended up bringing in different psychiatrists, of course, to back up their claims. Dr. Blinder was one of those called, as was Dr. Donald Holmes. Remember him, the one who put the sleepwalking bent on it? So he was called. And it should be noted that Dr. Holmes only interviewed Steve. He was the only one he interviewed and only interviewed Steve while he was behind bars. And in fact, Dr. Holmes had actually never before testified in his trial. This would be the first time. Now, in his testimony, Dr. Holmes took everything that Steve had told him in their interviews as gospel, all right? Just took it at face value. He didn't bother to research anything that Steve said. He just took Steve's word as it was. Never corroborated anything that Steve said, never interviewed anybody else. But don't worry, all right? Dr. Holmes said that he knows when people are lying to him. So he doesn't need need to corroborate anything. He said, quote, "As a psychiatrist, I've had 30 years experience in talking with thousands of people, and you do become computerized and sensitive and pretty accurate in your appraisal of when people are telling you the truth and when they are not." That is an exact quote from his testimony, guys. He's a psychiatrist, all right? He doesn't, he knows when people are lying. Okay. It's quite a superpower to have. That would be a super cool superpower to have. So, also throughout his testimony, Dr. Holmes pretty much reiterated everything that Dr. Blinder had put in his report, that Ilana was selfish, uncaring, spoiled, materialistic, and was always hounding Steve to make more money. Now, Dr. Holmes told him that Steve told him that it was Barney's fault that their pool and patio store had failed. It was all Barney's fault. And it was actually Barney who had taken money out of the safe at that third Singer's location. Remember at around like 11:30, Mitchell received that phone call from the manager? Yeah, Steve was saying that that was Barney, all right? He had robbed his own son. Now, Dr. Holmes didn't just bring up the sleepwalking bent in the defense's case. It was Dr. Holmes who actually first brought up the phrase Jewish American princess. He said that Steve had told him that Ilana was, quote, spoiled, overindulged brat, the stereotyped Jewish American princess. Dr. Holmes also testified that Steve told him that Tracy was a pit princess in training, and he was worried with the girls being with the Singers and being in their custody. He said that they will, quote, spoil her, bring her up the way they did Ilana. Yeah, the in-laws that were like pretty much his own parents. Yeah, who he had a super close relationship with. Yeah, now all of a sudden they raised an overindulged brat in Ilana. Now, Dr. Holmes testified that he was absolutely sure that Steve was in a deep sleep when he stabbed Ilana, and that he was in a deep sleep as he walked all the way from the master bedroom to the kitchen, grabbed the knife, and then walked back to the bedroom and stabbed Ilana 26 times. He said that Ilana's screams is probably what awoken Steve. And while he was still trying to transition from like deep sleep to full consciousness, he panicked, which is why he tried to hide the knife and stage the burglary in such a half-hearted, hazardly way. Dr. Holmes said that Steve's reaction was a, quote, psychotic, not a guilty reaction. Dr. Holmes had also evaluated the 911 call that had been made that night, and he said that based on that phone call, he believed that Steve was in the process of waking up from his deep sleep, transitioning to fully awake while on that phone call, and that the phone call was genuine, because to wake up from this deep state of consciousness, to wake up from like this deep of a sleep, it takes time. And so, yeah, he evaluated the call and was like, no, it's genuine. And he said that he could evaluate this phone call, all right, and evaluate it just by listening to the tape, because he was, quote, an experienced psychiatrist and could evaluate such things. So on the 911 call, Steve can be heard at the beginning of it, like screaming frantically that his wife had been stabbed, that he was bleeding, and for authorities to get there fast. And when the operator tried to get more information from Steve, like such as his name, he is heard on the tape saying, quote, Steinberg, don't fucking ask me questions, get here. And after this is when Tracy gets on the phone, who's like, you know, much more calm and stuff. Now, again, Dr. Holmes, to sell to the jury about this story of like sleepwalking and altered state of consciousness and whatnot, then went on about somnambulism. I hope I said that right. Which is just like a fancy word for sleepwalking, all right? That's pretty much what it is. And so it was Dr. Holmes who was going on about this. And he explained how Steve had it, that it ran in the family, and that even Tracy and Sean had it. He testified that Steve's mother, Esther, had said that his great aunt also suffered from sleepwalking. That one time, while she was asleep, she got out of bed, walked downstairs, took down her heavy velvet drapes that were in the living room, folded them up, stacked them, and then went back upstairs to bed. Now, Dr. Holmes told the jury that there was a lot of scientific literature on the subject, including literature on homicides committed while the perpetrator was sleepwalking. Hirsch had even asked Dr. Holmes if Ilana's screams would have woken Steve up, and Dr. Holmes said not necessarily, even though he had testified earlier that her screams did wake him up, hence why he tried to, stash the knife so haphazardly, but, whatever. He said that there was scientific literature that talked about incidents where people have, shot people while sleepwalking, and and still didn't even wake up after the gun went off. And he even cited a case where a man supposedly stabbed himself 4 times while he was sleepwalking, and he still didn't wake up. Now, when Hotham cross-examined Dr. Holmes and asked him what made him so sure that Steve was sleepwalking, Dr. Holmes said that, well, for one, the established character of Steve, that he was nonviolent, and secondly, the wounds on Ilana. At this point, stepping outside his expertise, Dr. Holmes then started testifying as if he was a pathologist. He said Ilana's wounds were in a, quote, stitching pattern that didn't aim to inflict any fatal wound. Dr. Holmes even said, on stand, guys, he even said, quote, "In fact, I'm not even satisfied as to what the cause of death was in Elana Steinberg's case." He actually said that. He said if Steve was conscious, why wouldn't he stab her with the, quote, intention of finishing her off? Why not do it with the first blow and stab only once or twice? Quote, "Why go punch, punch, punch? I can see myself and any other healthy male making a very successful single thrust." Yeah, he said this. He said this, guys. Not only is this dipshit's first testimony in a trial, like the first time that he's ever testified in a trial, but it is also the first time he had ever examined a stabbing. And sitting there saying that, like, oh yeah, if you're, you know, gonna consciously stab someone, obviously you would just go and do it with like 1 or 2 blows. Never mind the fact that the vast, overwhelming majority of stabbings have multiple stab wounds. The fact that it is very difficult for a normal, everyday person to stab someone successfully with only like 1 stab. But Hotham never did not question any of this, did not go after anything that I just told you, anything about Dr. Hotham's weaknesses at all. He didn't even go after Dr. Holmes's comment about like, oh, I don't even know what really killed Elana Steinberg. He just let him say it, guys. He didn't counter it. He didn't counter it. Why? Can you believe that? I'm sorry, but Hotham's work in this case is atrocious. And I do mean atrocious. So, remember when Dr. Holmes was talking about like all these scholarly and scientific articles and literature on like sleepwalking and homicides being done like when the person was sleepwalking? Remember when he was talking about all of that on the stand? Well, I read a book for this case, right? And so when the author of the book that I read, and I'll plug it at the end, when she did her own research, because she's of course, you know, writing for the book, writing about the case several years later, she went to Dr. Holmes and interviewed him, and suddenly, he didn't have any of those articles that he had mentioned. He said that he didn't really remember them, and he had found them on the AMA computer, and so yeah, he just didn't know. However, when the author of the book that I read used that same computer and that same methodology, she wasn't able to find these multitudes of like scientific literature about sleepwalking and homicide cases. She couldn't find them. Later, I guess she did find some psychiatric articles about some of these sleepwalking cases that Dr. Holmes had mentioned, but these like articles were only comprised of only a few sentences, didn't really offer any real insight or information, were not even cases that happened in the US, and they had actually been translated from other languages, so who knows what was lost in translation. And these little like articles were really just kind of like anecdotal. And when the author who interviewed Dr. Holmes confronted him about this, he was very, very anxious to assure her that he didn't do forensic work anymore, okay? He didn't do it anymore. And he seemed flustered when she kind of like pressed and questioned him on it. And like she had asked him like, hey, if you're so, quote, proud of your work on the Steinberg case, because he said many years later he was still proud of his work on this case. She asked him like, why not write an article about it? Like in a journal or something, you know? Like why not write something about it if you're so, quote, proud of the scientific work you did in this case? And yeah, he just like became flustered, just like, you know. And yeah, he's just kind of a joke. And honestly, actually, after the Steinberg case, Dr. Holmes never ever spoke about sleepwalking ever again. But even though we know Dr. Holmes is kind of a twat, not really knowing what he's talking about, that is not how he came across to the jury. Not at all. He came across as very knowledgeable and like he really knew what he was talking about. Though some of the jurors later claimed that they never for once bought his sleepwalking theory, and they actually said that the way he described Ilana's character had more impact on their decision than anything he said about sleepwalking. I guess because it was coming from like a doctor, a supposed expert, especially on like human behavior, you know, like psychiatrist or whatever. And so like, yeah, to them, that was the most effective part of Dr. Holmes's testimony, is him crapping on Ilana and her character. I mean, and honestly, a lot of that has to do with just the awful work that Hotham has done on this case, guys. Like, it's so bad. I mean, dude, I just told you about some of the research that the author of the book that I read for this case, like, she did more research research than the dang prosecutor in this case did, you know? And it's just really unbelievable. Like, the author of this book had even gotten interviews with, like, actual doctors who are experts in sleepwalking. And Hotham never did any of this, didn't bother to do any research for this trial. And the author of the book, yeah, she interviewed a couple of experts in sleepwalking, and yeah, they were telling her that sleepwalking is extremely rare, especially in adults. It usually affects children. And yeah, man, just so many missed opportunities. So continuing on with his experts, Hirsch then called Dr. Blinder to the stand. And again, like with Dr. Holmes, the jury was just putty in his hands. So Dr. Blinder, he actually consciously knew what he was doing with his testimony. And in fact, he had even written a book about how, like, evidence isn't even the most important part of a trial. It's how you come off to the jury. And Dr. Blinder, all right, he was charismatic, and he was able to speak in layman terms, you know, like really being able to break down these, you know, big medical words and stuff like that, and able to, you know, make them digestible to a common everyday person, like the people sitting on the jury. He was very good at that. And he was really able to just spin a story. He was a great storyteller, and he just decimated the character of Ilana. Just decimated, went to town on her. His whole testimony was just about painting Ilana as just like a bitch, and Steve as the long-suffering husband. And finally, he just snapped, all right? He just snapped after so much pressure. And in fact, that's actually something Dr. Blinder talked about in his book, where he talks about, like, even if the evidence is overwhelmingly stacked against the defendant, like in this case, it's more important to show the jury that the defendant was not a threat to them, that the danger has now passed, that the trouble that had caused the defendant to do what they did was no more, and thus was not a threat to them or the public. And that is exactly what Dr. Blinder did with his testimony. And this just worked swimmingly. Not only did Dr. Blinder reiterate that Ilana was a, quote, Jewish American princess who made her husband suffer, he also painted her as cold and frigid and just really decimated her character. He pretty much said, like, every stereotypical thing a man can say about a woman and a husband about his wife is pretty much what Dr. Blinder was doing. Saying that she was materialistic, nothing was ever good enough for her, didn't consult Steve on domestic matters. Well, Steve, you know, was just hardworking, just a saint. He's just always trying to please his nagging, over-demanding wife. Dr. Blinder even described Ilana as withholding of sex, which caused Steve, who was like a pressure cooker, to just snap. This is what he's saying, guys. Now, Dr. Blinder incorrectly in his testimony talked about cervical cancer. Apparently, Ilana had it in 1979, and I guess she had cancer of the cervix. And after that, she had valley fever. And because of her mom, she had thought that she had gotten cancer due to sexual intercourse. Now, research does show that if a partner, of course, has a venereal disease, it can in fact cause cervical cancer. But Dr. Blinder said that this was malarkey. And even though he's not a gynecologist, has absolutely no knowledge about this subject, he instead said that Ilana used the fact that she had cervical cancer as an excuse to withhold sex from Steve. That's how he painted her suffering from these illnesses back to back and not really wanting to have sex as a way of just controlling Steve and just being cold. Had nothing to do with her having pretty serious, like, I tried to find out a little bit more about this, like, cancer that she had. I think it might have just been a scare or something, but yeah, can you believe that? He criticized Ilana's sexual performance, saying that she performed sex with Steve with, quote, not much enthusiasm and no, quote, words of affection. And because of this, Steve had sought out sex workers. Yeah. So not only was he putting Ilana on trial, but he was now saying that Steve was seeking out affairs with sex workers due to their mediocre sex. That's what Dr. Blinder was saying in his testimony here. However, that's all the jury heard about this particular fact. Hirsch objected to the mention of more of Steve's affairs. Obviously, that wasn't going to go well for what they're trying to paint Steve as. Hotham did try to bring in the fact that Steve had sought out sex workers, tried to bring up this little detail in trial to get it admitted. He had even found a sex worker who would agree to testify that she actually slept with Steve regularly. But in arguments in chambers, the judge sided with Hirsch. And so this particular angle was quickly dropped. And remember, Hirsch is a really good debater. He's good at cross-examination, good at asking questions, and Hotham is very weak in that department. So when it came time to argue this particular fact in front of the judge took Hirsch's side. And honestly, if Hotham just did his job better, he really could have successfully argued for this point to be admitted, because remember, Steve is going for the insanity defense. And there was an Arizona State Supreme Court ruling that said if a defendant was trying to get off with the insanity defense, the jury was entitled to hear about all of the defendant's past, all of it. But apparently, according to the author of the book I read, Hotham wasn't even aware of this little fact. Wasn't even aware of it because he had done so little research. He was so sure that he had Steve dead to rights. All throughout Dr. Blinder's testimony, all throughout, guys, the jury was wrapped with attention. They were on the edge of their seats, like literally on the edge of their seats, just like, oh my God, what? And some of them were writing notes. They were absorbed in everything he was saying. Dr. Blinder in his testimony also tried to say that Steve was the real businessman of the family, and it was because of him that the BB Singers restaurants were successful. Yeah, you know, the restaurants that started when he had literally nothing to do with it? Yeah. Okay. He painted Barney and Mitch as useless, tried to say that Barney was the one who had robbed the third BB Singers location earlier in the evening. But yet, for all of his hard work, Steve never got any credit, and he was just put upon by the Singers, alright? They were so mean to him. And guys, like, this kind of bull, his testimony went on for hours, just decimating Ilana, just decimating the Singers. And Hotham, it is said, never once countered it, never fought back or pushed back. He just sat back and let this happen. And by the way, Ilana's parents were not at the trial. They were just too busy in mourning, and they just, and I think it's a good thing that they're away from the trial. Can you imagine having to sit there and hear these awful things said about your child who was so brutally murdered? The most damning part, as he had been, perfecting them and coaching them for months now, Hirsch brought in his parade of witnesses, friends of the Steinbergs and of Steven. Remember, he had carefully selected these friends, and he went out of his way to make sure that the jury knew that these people had not been subpoenaed. They were here of their own free will, because that's how much they believed in their friend Steve. And through their testimony, some knowing what they were doing, others not really catching on to what was really going on, they all just trashed Ilana. Hirsch especially harped on the immaculate interior decorating that Ilana had done for the home and the upkeep that she had done. Other friends had damning testimony that painted Ilana as a professional shopper and almost seemed to criticize how lavish she was, which is funny because remember, these were in their inner circle. They were running with some pretty upper class people. These were wives of stockbrokers and businessmen, and they have the nerve to sit there and talk smack about the money Ilana spent and her lavish upkeep of her home. Frankly, from what I read in the book, because of course there were quotes that the author put in the book of what these people said, came off to me like a bunch of jealous, desperate housewives who were just kind of jealous of Ilana's upkeep. But yeah, I just thought it was funny that these upper class people, who I'm sure waste money and throw it away, were sitting there criticizing Ilana and her spending of money. I thought that was really funny. Maybe not really funny, more ironic. And guys, these friends did testimony for 2 days. 2 days! Hirsch paraded these people out in front of the jury and they really trashed Ilana. One of them even had a story about how one time they were throwing a party at their house and the Steinbergs were there, and there was some, famous entertainer there, and this friend wanted to introduce this entertainer to Steve. And when this friend told the entertainer, introduced him to Steve, was like, oh yeah, he runs the Singers restaurants. Ilana correctly said, quote, no, my brother Mitch runs those. And this friend on the stand actually said, quote, I felt embarrassed for Steve. Why? Because he lied and presented himself as something that he wasn't? Are you kidding me? He had nothing to do with the success of BB Singers restaurants. They were already a success when he came on board. And again, Hotham, because he is terrible and just unprepared, did not cross-examine any of these friends, guys. He didn't cross-examine any of them. Any of them. He didn't cross-examine them. Didn't ask them what were Ilana's good qualities or anything like that. Steve's sister Gloria took the stand and reiterated what Esther, their mother, had, that the singers were materialistic and upper class, whereas, they themselves, the Steinbergs, they were just normal middle-class people who went bowling, not to fancy restaurants. And, because of this, their time with Steve was cut off short when he married Ilana. Another witness would present itself for the defense. This witness actually came in the middle of the trial. So this was a woman who lived next door to Steve and Elana for 3 years in Scottsdale. And like I just said, she inserted herself into this trial as it was ongoing. She called up the defense, again, the middle of the trial, and was brought in to testify. Hotham did not object to her testifying, guys. He didn't even know what she was going to say. He didn't interview her or anything, and he didn't object. This woman's name was Jean Marie Timms, and she was the wife of an Arizona corporation commissioner. I know. And she pulled out all the stops in her testimony, guys, all right? She described Ilana as, quote, not being very nice to Steve, and said she was, quote, domineering. She said Steve was affectionate and he was loving, but none of that affection was ever returned. She claimed that Ilana had spoken down to her own maids, her own Mrs. Timms maids, that Ilana spoke down to the help. And when she spoke to them, her tone of voice let them know, what their place was. She said Ilana had a, quote, high-pitched and shrill voice. Not sure what that has to do with anything, and was a compulsive talker. She said how Steve could do nothing right for Ilana, saying, quote, if he was cleaning out the pool, he wasn't doing it right. If he was carrying out the garbage, he made a mess. I didn't hear him raise his voice to her. The most he would say was, I can hear you, when she was yelling, and he was just a couple feet away in the backyard. I said to my husband, I really don't know how Steve manages to work in the store all day and then go home to what he goes home to at night. Yeah, that was an actual quote that she said. Now, as she was testifying, Jean came across too many in the audience, the observer side. She came across too many as just being a very nosy, bored housewife who saw an opportunity to, jazz up her otherwise boring suburban upper class lifestyle. That's how she came off to a lot of the observers. In fact, she even mimicked Steve and Ilana's voices. When you're talking about someone, is like, oh yeah, and then he was like, oh yeah, you know how you change your voice? That's what she did as she was testifying. But Unfortunately, to the jury, Jean here was phenomenal. She came across to them as probably the best eyewitness they had to what life was like behind closed doors at the Steinbergs. Oh, by the way, so the 3 years that the Timms lived next door to Steve and Elana, get this, they weren't even living there. They had rented out the property to a young couple from India, and they were the ones who lived next door to Steve and Elana those 3 years. And honestly, it really would not have been hard at all for Hotham to find a friend or a neighbor to counter what the defense was saying about Ilana. It really would not have been difficult. The author of the book I read found plenty. And they all said, yeah, dude, no one from the prosecution ever called me. Ever. By the way, the author also found the young Indian couple who lived next door to Ilana and Steve. And in the book, she interviewed them. The woman, whose name I'm sure I'm gonna butcher, but her name was Pawan Nandam. I don't know how bad I screwed that up, but yeah, she found this neighbor, and this neighbor described Ilana as just sweet, generous, very kind to both to her and her husband, which she said she greatly appreciated because they were in this foreign country and she was young and she was scared, and Ilana was just very friendly and open and welcoming to her, and she really appreciated that. She said that she much preferred them over the Timms who had lived there because they weren't very nice. And she said that they had treated her and Steve as if they were beneath them. Yeah, the author of the book found this crucial witness that Hotham could have used, but he didn't even try. And honestly, guys, I cannot stress to you the awful job Hotham did prosecuting this case. He was so bad. Hirsch and his team were amazed that they were allowed to have this testimony from the friends and everyone, and the prosecution didn't object at all. In fact, Hirsch said that he was dumbfounded that Hirsch did not object to anything that Mrs. Timms was saying, and was just shocked how much he was just letting her go on and on. Even Hirsch was amazed. And by the end of this brutal 2 days of just awful testimony against Ilana's character, it was super clear and obvious to everyone that Ilana was really the one on trial here. It was Ilana who was on trial, not Steve. One headline even read, quote, "Witnesses for Steinberg paint portrait of wife as free-spending shrew." That's an actual headline. And to make matters worse for the prosecution, the experts that Hotham had got to kind of counter the defense's experts were just, not very good. So he had called two experts, two psychiatrists, Doctors Howard Gray and Michael Cleary. And yeah, they were not very good at all. They seemed uninterested in the case. They came across to the jury as just boring. And even at the end of each of their testimonies, the jury wasn't even sure whose witnesses they were supposed to be, the prosecution's or the defense's, because they didn't really do much for the prosecution. This case was beginning to become like a Murphy's Law case for the prosecution. The defense, dude, this case was going so swimmingly for them. Hirsch actually called some of the friends and witnesses that they had and said, you know what, this is going so well, we don't even need you to come in. Steve himself took the stand. Yes, Steve himself took the stand. And all throughout his trial, right, all throughout the testimonies and everything and the evidence being shown, Steve had wept uncontrollably at just the right moments. Several times even putting his head down on the table and like weeping. And his legal team even attempted to console him. They were really like hamming it up. When he testified, Hirsch and his team treated Steve with kid gloves. Even the author of the book, she described it as this. She said, quote, "His lawyer took him through the direct examination, quietly, carefully, as one would an invalid." And during one part of his questioning, like just to kind of highlight what the author's talking about here, his lawyer, Hirsch was asking him basic stuff, like when he and Ilana married and stuff. And part of that transcript goes, so question, "And they all helped throw the wedding, did they not?" Steve answered, "Yes, my parents helped pay for it." No, they didn't. And then question, "And we're not going to cry. We're going to get through this, all right?" That was Hirsch coddling Steve. It went like that. Good Lord. Like just reading about it, I was just like, are you kidding me? Come on. And they were really treating Steve as if he was like this mollycoddled wimp, Never mind that he was a 6'1" strapping man, was like slim but still kind of trim and built, due to his prison life, and just did not at all physically represent the character that they were trying to paint. So they were really hamming it up with their testimony and how they asked him questions and stuff, Steve took the high road during his testimony and did not talk smack about his in-laws, even though he had said terrible things to all the psychiatrists. He said he loved Barney and, quote, felt sorry for Mitchell. He talked about how he thought he and Ilana had a marriage based on love. But now that he thought about it, there was a lot of money involved. And he did start to notice that when they had money, they were happy. And he very carefully played the role of, dutiful, loyal husband who was just put upon and didn't realize just how unhappy he was. Hotham's cross-examination of Steve was very brief and revolved only around one thing, Steve's gambling. Steve admitted on the stand that he was a compulsive gambler, and he recounted his precarious financial situation at the time of Ilana's murder. He said that the day that she was killed, he had borrowed $5 from her to put gas in the car, but he had only put $3 worth of gas because he needed to save the rest for change to make phone calls. By the way, can you imagine putting gas in your car for $3? I wish. Anyway, he had phone calls to make to the banks because he needed to try to secure another bank loan. He said he had plans to meet George Morrison at the Continental Bank the next day to see if he could secure yet another $10,000 loan. And at this point in his testimony, Steve was crying and like openly weeping. And he said that he couldn't tell Ilana or any of his family about his predicament because, quote, they would think I was a failure. Well, you kind of are, bro. Now, although Steve was opening up about his gambling on stand, he noticeably left out any gambling problems he had in Chicago, and he really downplayed his gambling during that time, saying, he placed a bet here or there. It is said Steve was just really good on the stand, really good, cried when he needed to, really sold it without like weeping uncontrollably right when he needed to. He was very good on stand. In fact, he was so good. Members of the jury were actually teary-eyed by the end of his testimony. Teary-eyed. They were buying everything hook, line, and sinker. A column in one of the local papers described Steve's testimony as, quote, his face was ashen, and he seemed only inches away from total collapse. Yeah, apparently the press was buying it as well. And there were places that Hotham could have countered, guys. There are places in Steve's testimony that he could have at least pushed against the idea and the character that the defense was painting of Steve. Since they were talking about Steve's financial position, he never brought up the fact that Steve's financial position with Ilana dead was now much, much better. He had the 2 CDs that Ilana had so painstakingly reserved. He had the house, the jewelry, and money from Ilana's life insurance policy. And Hotham never brought this up at all. He didn't even bring up the other robberies and burglaries that Steve had been involved with, guys. And remember, the authorities, the cops knew about these, and Edith and Barney said that they informed Hotham about these as well, and he never brought them up once. This guy, I'm sorry, Hotham's performance in this trial can only be described as incompetent. When it's time to finally bring the case to the jury for deliberation, Hotham asked the judge if they could open it up to second-degree murder. Was that something that the jury could deliberate on? Because as it was, Steve was on trial for first-degree murder. But the judge, he disagreed and said no. To the judge, Ilana's murder was either premeditated or not. There was no in-between. And for the judge, it was the 66-foot walk from the bedroom to the kitchen that really sealed it for him. And it convinced him that this crime was premeditated, quote, under the scope of the law. Now, Hotham did try to argue to the judge that, hey, the jury's definition and like normal people's definition of premeditation isn't the same as ours as legal experts, you know? But the judge wouldn't hear of it, and so when the jury was given the case, they had to determine if Steve was guilty of first-degree premeditated murder, not guilty by reason of insanity, or just flat out not guilty. And it took the jury less than 3 hours to render their verdict. And on February 17th, 1982, the jury found Steve Steinberg not guilty by reason of insanity. Hirsch had won another one. Everyone in Steve's family embraced him. He put his head down on the table and even cried. He embraced his mother. Even 2 of the jurors came down and actually embraced Steve in a hug, saying, quote, God bless you, Steve. At one point, I guess when Steve was walking past the jurors' room, they were in there gathering their belongings, getting ready to leave. One lady saw him walk by, one of the jurors, and said, quote, we all love you, Steve. God loves the sinner. Hotham, as soon as the verdict had been read, slipped out the side door with his tail between his legs. Now, the problem with Hotham slipping out like a little coward is that Arizona law requires that if you are found not guilty by reason of insanity, the prosecutor needs to immediately begin a civil commitment procedure. And this is a petition which is asking for a mental health evaluation of the defendant to determine if they are a danger to themselves or others. If they are then sent to a state hospital, and if not, they are free to just walk out. It is known as Rule 25. But since Hotham had slipped out and no one could find him, the court appointed a trial supervisor in his place. This trial supervisor's name was Mark Butoff. Now, when Butoff went in front of the judge to argue for the, Rule 25, the civil commitment procedure, Hirsch pointed out that Rule 25, it also permits the judge to make that decision, not a state hospital, that the judge could look at all of the evidence that was presented in trial and determine themselves if the defendant needed to go be evaluated. Hirsch argued that there'd been a total of 4 psychiatrists on the stand, each of which said there was not a thing wrong with Steve. So remember, even though Blinder and Holmes had testified that, Steve was in a deep sleep and all that other stuff, they said that there was nothing else wrong with him, that he was perfectly healthy and fine now, And then, of course, the prosecution's experts were, of course, saying that there was nothing wrong with Steve, that he was full of it, and there was nothing wrong with him. Hirsch even pointed out some comments that Hotham had made in the judge's chambers at some point about saying that he didn't believe there was anything wrong with Steve at all, and that commitment for him was unlikely. And the judge agreed with Hirsch's reasonings, and so Steve Steinberg walked out of court a free man. And the first night of his freedom was spent going to all of the Singer's restaurants. They were now, I think, under new ownership. I think they were called different things, but he went to those same locations because some of the old employees were still there. And it said he was in a jovial, celebratory mood. Now, a couple of employees who were at the bar working, and again, had worked with Steve and, had been aware of everything, they described the atmosphere there when Steve got there as, quote, cold, and that the whole whole vibe seemed to be that, like, no one really knew how to talk to him, how to approach him. He was joking around, and I guess even jokingly put his hands on, like, a woman's breasts, joking that he'd been locked up for 9 months. Yeah, and he was just, like, laughing and being inappropriate. The employees that all worked there and who had worked there with Steve before this and were there that night, it is said that all of them, any positive feelings or any doubts they had about Steve's guilt or anything like that vanished after that night. It vanished. And seeing Steve gloat and float around the room and just be all, like, jovial and stuff just really smashed any doubts in their mind that he was in fact guilty. It said he showed no remorse, never brought up Ilana, of course, and said that the only thing he regretted was being unfairly locked up for 9 months. He had even called Edith and, like, talked to her and was, like, in a like a happy mood and just like, oh yeah, can you believe I got off on these charges and stuff? And, like, Edith said that he talked to her as if, like, she should be, like, happy for him. Because remember, I said this earlier, Barney and Edith did not attend the trial. They just couldn't, and I'm so glad they didn't. Like, that would have been so horrible. After the trial, Steven relinquished all of his parental rights over Tracy and Sean, and the two daughters were then raised by Barney and Edith. It is said that they never spoke to or met with their father ever again. Don't know if that continued into their adulthood. The Singers also did not contest Steve's acquisition of Ilana's estate. They just didn't have the will or the money at that point. And honestly, if Steve was actually a decent man and actually a father, I think he should have established a trust for his daughters with that money. And Hirsch and his team said that he was going to, but he never did. Now, I tried really hard to find out what happened to Steve afterward, and I couldn't really find anything. Steven Steinberg is a pretty common name. I did come across a comment. It was from 2009. It was from someone who claimed to have worked with Steve at a restaurant in the Bay Area around 2007, 2008. And I just wanted to read their comment just because based on what they said, I wonder, like, I think they actually did work with him. So I'll be looking down. It's a pretty long comment. So it said, quote, I worked for a well-known corporate chain of restaurants in 2007, 2008. Steve Steinberg was hired as a floor supervisor, and right away, everyone was creeped out by this old man who could barely keep up with the hustle and bustle of the biz. Guess he was desperate for work. He would make inappropriate comments, get all pissed off, and start physically shaking when he could not go have a smoke. Me and all the other guys knew something strange was up with this guy. He would come out and schmooze with the customers and hand out lollipops to kids, and then turn around and be a creep to the employees. Those parents had no idea their kid was taking candy from a murderer. I think it's just really messed up that my safety was compromised by having to work in a restaurant with this man because the justice system failed. Beware of any old white male restaurant managers named Steve, and let all your coworkers know right away what's up. Yeah, I thought that was super, super interesting. It certainly tracks because he does have restaurant experience, and from what I could gather from some of the employees who described his behavior, that sounds exactly like Steve. And there was another commenter in that same thread from 2010 that said that Steve was actually living in San Jose, California. And a comment from someone in that same thread, this one was from 2014, did verify this, saying that they saw him around town. And they said that he worked for his brother there and was involved in yet another high-profile robbery. Now, I tried finding newspaper articles or anything like this, and I came up with nothing. This comment thread is all I could find. Another comment on that same thread, it read, quote, and it's kind of long too, so again, I'll be looking down. So it read, quote, I worked for the firm that helped Ilana's parents gain custody of the children. I also met him when he came in to sign the papers after his acquittal. Just couldn't get over how perfectly sane he appeared sitting there in his yellow polo shirt. He looked like a free man, but I don't see how he could ever feel that way again. I don't think any of us were ever so shocked as we were at this verdict, and after all these years, I still think of him, her, and their children. Some of the other staff had occasion to be in the home they shared shortly after the murder, and told me that even after the cleanup, there were still blood spatters on the baseboards. words. I could have gone as well, and I am so glad I didn't. As I recall, it seems I heard talk that he was discussing some movie deal, and I really hope that never happened. It also seems to me that I heard his defense cost anywhere around $1 million. It still amazes me what money can buy. What an incredible miscarriage of justice. Now, I did read that the Steinberg daughters did eventually move to the Phoenix area, and I read that one actually became a prosecutor while the other became a homemaker, but that's all I could find. I didn't really try to dig too deep into that, but that was what I could find, what happened to Tracy and Sean. And in a bizarre twist that I came across, you know Dr. Blinder, you know, the a-hole who wrote that scathing report? In October of 2000, he was stabbed by his second ex-wife, Dorothy Bracco, and he survived, but Dorothy ended up killing herself by throwing herself off the Golden Gate Bridge after she attacked him. And Dr. Blinder's first wife also committed suicide. Just thought that was a bizarre, interesting end. Now, after this trial, Arizona changed their insanity laws and how they worked. So instead of the prosecutor having to prove that the defendant is sane, the onus is now on the defendant to prove that they are insane. And there is currently a series being developed about this case. I heard it is being written by Kari Lynn, or is it Carrie Lynn, and Everywhere Studios. As of the recording of this video, there is no buyer or distributor as of yet, but based on the article I read, it really shouldn't be hard for them to find a buyer for this. So there will be a series, movie, there will be something made about this case, and it is not just based on this case, it is based on the book that I read for this case. And that book I read was Death of a Jewish American Princess. I know the cover looks like really cheesy and corny. This was just one of the editions cover. I don't like it at all, but it was very well written. The author, Shirley Frondorf, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but she did so much great research on this. And I read some people criticizing the book saying like, oh, this was Shirley's chance to really do Ilana justice and she didn't. First of all, no one is all good or all bad, all right? And I think Shirley did a fantastic job in representing Ilana as the human being that she was very caring and loving. And so I don't know what those people were talking about. I think she painted Ilana as a human being, honestly. And that's kind of what made me so angry in this case. She did such a good job of just showing Ilana as she was a human being. She had 2 children. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, you know what I mean? And to have her character so thoroughly pummeled like this, that's why this took me a while to get through, because there were parts where Steve's friends were saying stuff and the parts where they were talking about the friends' testimonies, and I had to set it down because I was like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me with this? You know? That was another thing that the author brings up in this book, is that phrase Jewish American princess. Apparently, like, I'm not Jewish. I don't really know anyone who's Jewish or traditionally Jewish. If you are or know someone, please inform me. So this phrase, Jewish American princess, apparently it's like a pretty well-known phrase in the Jewish community. And from what I could gather, it kind of sounds like just kind of the description of kind of like your stereotypical desperate housewife, you know, we're just rich chick who wants nice things, everything has to be prim and proper and stuff like that. But the author in the book was pointing out that, like, what really could have helped the prosecution was having a prosecutor who was Jewish themselves. In fact, they said Hotham did try to get a Jewish prosecutor assigned to this case, but he wasn't able to, and so it was him, because apparently, like, that phrase did not really have a lot of meaning to the jury, who I believe were all white. At least mostly, like, there were no Jewish people on the jury. And yeah, they were just saying that, like, having a Jewish prosecutor and being able to really dissect what they were saying about Ilana when they were saying that she was a Jewish American princess probably could have helped kind of break this down for the jury of what they were doing. I don't know, I thought that was super interesting. So please, like, let me know. Have you heard of this phrase? I've never heard of this phrase, Jewish American princess. So please let me know if you've heard of it. And please let me know, what do you think about this case? Isn't this case crazy? Like, I don't know. Something about this case makes me more angry than the Candy Montgomery case. I don't know. I don't know what it is. Like, is it because Candy was a woman and Steve is a man? I don't know. Because in Candy's case, they did a little bit of that to Betty in their trial, where they were saying that she was kind of like a bitch and no one really liked her and this, that, and the other, you know? Whereas Candy was this sociable, vivacious chick that everyone loved. But I don't know. In that case, it felt like it wasn't nearly to the degree that happened to Ilana. So I don't know what what it is, man. I don't know. I personally, I don't think, this is just my opinion, I don't think Steve sleepwalked. I honestly think either he did it as premeditation or they got into an argument and he just decided to stab her. Either way, I think he did it on purpose. I don't think he was in altered state of consciousness or anything. That's just my opinion personally. I, of course, think that he should have served many, many years behind bars, but he didn't. And if you're going to take that comment thread that I found underneath an article about this case, he's walking around free in San Jose. So, I don't know. That was just my opinion on it. Please tell me your opinion. Did Steve, how did this case work out for you? Was it justified? Are you angry? Should Steve have served some time? What do you think about some of the things said about Ilana in this trial? Isn't it awful? I think it's awful. And I think it's so funny that 12-year-old Tracy was cognizant enough and smart enough to pick up on what was going on, but so many adults around her were just in the dark. And yeah, man, apparently this case has really kind of stained Scottsdale. Everyone thinks it was a miscarriage of justice. Nobody really wants to talk about it. And yeah, man, I really recommend reading this book. Like I said, the author talks with some of Steve's friends, talks with some of the people who talk smack on Ilana, and it's just really amazing to see the author kind of confront them a little bit and ask them, so what do you really think after all these years, you know? That was the Steinberg case, guys. This was a long one. I told you, this case, there was just so much, especially with the trial, that I was like, wait, this happened? This was said? No. I have to include it. I have to include it. So, I will let you go. I'm sure you're sick of hearing me talk. I'm sick of talking. And next week, I don't know if you're gonna be mad at me or not. It is another two-parter. It was another case that was recommended to me by you guys. And yeah, just like with this case, I just found detail after detail that I was like, oh my God, what? Because I have heard of the case before, but I'd never really taken a deep dive into it. And I was learning stuff that I had no idea had happened. So I cannot wait to meet with you all next Tuesday for another two-parter series. We'll get into part 1. But until that time, until next Tuesday, I hope you do take care of yourself out there. I hope just, be safe and happy. Remember, don't be a douche, all right? Don't be a dick. Don't be like Steve, all right? Treat people with just respect. Try to be nice, all right? And people treat you like shit, try not to give an F. I know it sucks, but just try to hang your head high and walk along. I know it's really tough right now. Well, that would do it for this week on Crime Dive. Have an excellent week. Thank you so much for spending some time with me, and I will see you all here next week. Bye-bye!